What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm here to bring you the review of Game of Thrones Season 4, Episode 4, entitled Oathbreaker. The upload marathon continues. So let's get right into the summary and analysis of this episode. Just a couple of quick thoughts, though, before I get to the important stuff I want to get to. Nothing much really happened in this episode. However, the things that did happen were quite pivotal and substantive. But first, let's get to the important stuff. Gotta talk about Peter Baelish and Olenna Martell. So I guess we know at least who one of the friends are who Peter Baelish referenced. Uh, Quite remarkable. So at this point, it's pretty clear that Baelish really did conspire to have Joffrey killed. And at first, I honestly didn't believe him when he told Sansa that he really did conspire to commit regicide. But his reasoning seems very plausible. And it's pretty clear that he really did conspire to bring about Joffrey's death. And everyone knows he can't be trusted anyway. Well, at least all the intelligent people in the show. Not named Ned Stark. Sorry about that. I had to give a little dig at Ned Stark. In any event, like I was saying, everybody knows that Peter Baelish can't be trusted, and his reasoning seems plausible. So that seems to lend some credence to the idea that he really did conspire to have Joffrey killed. And on top of this, Olenna Martell apparently had some role in it as well. That was quite surprising to me. I won't say shocking, but I was a tad bit surprised at this development. However, the the extent of the political alliance between Olenna Martell and Peter Baelish has yet to be fully explored or revealed. The only thing we know is that they are friends and that they have some sort of political alliance going on, but it's not clear precisely what the nature of that political alliance is. And I find this alliance between Olenna Martell, if it can be called an alliance, and I will call it that at least preliminarily until we get some more information about precisely how those two people are connected. But what's fascinating, I find this alliance between Olenna Martell and Peter Baelish to be quite fascinating and intriguing for a couple of reasons. First, I love the diversity of the array of power available to the various characters. And in this particular context, I'm talking about how politics functions as an equalizer, especially for women, with respect to all of the different types of power that get wielded in this series. And we see a power take various forms in this series. The authority of clerics, religious people, the authority of kings, economic power, social power, cultural power, physical power, political power. I mean, and within each of those domains, it breaks down even further and further and further. And so, with respect to political power, I find it to be a great equalizer for women in this series, and we see that through Olenna Martell in this particular episode. And I just love the way this episode plays out, and I love this development of the, I want to call it the ascendance of Olenna Martell in the Game of Thrones. Uh, but I will say this: on one hand, I find the depiction of women by, well, I'm not really sure what creative input George R. R. Martin has in the TV show. My understanding is that he has very little and that the TV show is its own thing, separate from the canon established in the Game of Thrones novels. Uh, but with that being said, I find the depiction of women, at least by the writers in the show, to be somewhat problematic. There's what I take to be gratuitous physical and psychological mutilation of women via patriarchy. And that's essentially what it is, a sort of socio-cultural mutilation of women depicted in the series to an oftentimes gratuitous extent. And yes, I get it. It's supposed to be realism. And yes, I understand that it's also supposed to be somewhat hyperbolic because after all, it is epic fantasy. And it's realism to the extent that it's supposed to be a sort of realistic historical representation of the unfolding events of a civilization. So I understand that. And I understand if you're taking your influences from real life that you would expect to see some of these things play out with respect to various forms of violence against women. And I also understand it's supposed to be hyperbolic, it's supposed to be somewhat of an exaggeration, again, because it's epic fantasy, but also because the whole series, like I've said multiple times, is about uh, a sort of psychopathology of violence and what happens when uh, that gets disseminated within an entire culture and civilization. And they've just really taken that impulse to the nth degree. So on one hand, I find the depiction of women to be problematic because of those reasons just outlined. But on the other hand, multiple women throughout the Game of Thrones are empowered in very realistic and concrete ways. And one of these ways is via obvious ways is via sex and sexuality. And we saw this from Cersei to Daenerys and even Olenna, which she was talking about in this episode with Marjorie. But also, like I was alluding to, we see it through their political machinations, through their scheming, through their statecraft, and now even through political assassinations. Because that's what Olenna Martell just engaged in. The exercise of political power through a political assassination. Striking at not just some fodder character, but striking at the Lannisters, the almighty, praise Jesus, Lannister family. That's some pretty cool shit. And we've seen this for various female characters from Cersei, Daenerys, Catelyn Stark. I mean, Olenna was just a perfect example of that motif in this episode. So I absolutely love that. The second reason why I find the alliance between Olenna Martell and Peter Baelish to be intriguing is because Olenna must know who Peter Baelish is. I mean, after all, she allied with him to kill a Lannister who was also a king. She's not stupid enough to really believe that Peter Baelish can be genuinely trusted, right? She's shown herself, alliterative tongue twister there. She's shown herself to be shrewd and judicious on several occasions. So with that being said, how does Olenna Martell intend to manage Peter Baelish going forward? And of course, I put manage in quotations because she might have to kill that nigga. Just saying, she might have to kill him. Although in a head-to-head battle, I think that Baelish would probably have the upper hand. So if anything, he'd probably kill her before she got to him. But in any event, once people conspire to commit regicide, they don't just part ways. They don't just go their separate ways after that. So it seems like for the foreseeable future, Olenna Martell and Peter Baelish are really going to be inextricably tied to each other. And Peter Baelish, I mean, forget Olenna Martell, Peter Baelish isn't just gonna let loose ends go untied, right? So I don't think it would be too far fetched for me to predict that maybe at some point in the future, Olenna might be killed off by Peter Baelish. Or maybe even Baelish should be killed off by Olenna. I'm just saying. I don't think that would be too far-fetched, given what we know about this series. Also, the third reason why I really find this whole scene and this whole alliance to be intriguing is because if you pay attention to what Baelish tells Sansa, he says he has friends. He doesn't say he has a friend. He says he has friends, plural. So who else is involved? That's the obvious implication. If you have friends, we know one is Olenna Martell, and we know that it's probably the case that Baelish and Olenna couldn't have done this just by themselves. There must have been other players involved, but it's hard to really imagine who else it could be. So at this point, there seems a pretty high probability that there are other people involved in this conspiracy to kill Joffrey. But like I said, hard to imagine who else it would be, and it's hard to imagine who else is a big enough player in the Game of Thrones to ally themselves with vipers to commit regicide. That's that's pretty tall. That's a pretty tall order. And not just commit regicide, kill a Lannister. Strike at the heart of the Lannister family itself. This whole thing gets curiouser and curiouser. So now let's talk about Daenerys. I distinctly remember telling people to watch out for Daenerys. In other words, I said that she shouldn't be trusted to be this wise and morally righteous leader that she's being set up to be. We all know about George Martin's penchant for narrative inversion and narrative subversion. So you shouldn't be surprised if, given the setup of our expectations, that those expectations are drastically turned upside down, just turned uh, on their heads. And what Daenerys did in this episode shows that she, in fact, may not be the judicious, wise, and morally righteous ruler that you should expect her to be. Uh, Especially when she's talking to Sir Barristan Selmy. Barristan? Whatever. That you know who I'm talking about. That guy. And he's telling her, wait a minute, maybe you don't want to kill all the people who are ruling Marine. Just saying, you might want to take a path of less bloodshed. Maybe you should answer injustice with mercy. And Daenerys turns to him like, I'll answer injustice with justice. Not really sure if you can call rounding up people for mass murder justice. It's just that's just my take on the matter. Maybe some of you out there feel a little bit different about mass murder, but that's just that's just the way I feel. And I find this interesting because I was in a live stream discussion. Actually, I was in one of the earlier small councils. I believe it was episode 1, uh, with Otaku Symbol, aka Larry Williams. And he mentioned the difference between a Messiah complex and a Messiah effect. And at the time, I thought that was a very astute distinction. Very subtle, but very important distinction. However, the context of Game of Thrones as a story, as a narrative, given its themes and motifs, it doesn't seem like the type of story that would lend itself to one of its characters having a Messiah effect, but not a Messiah complex. In other words, can you name a person in Game of Thrones who has not been corrupted by power, especially political power? And Rob and Ned don't count because they were idiots. They were just flat out fools. They were naive, gullible idiots. And they're dead, so they don't count anyway. Can you name a character? I don't think so. I certainly can't think of any off the top of my head. Hmm. Nope, can't think of any. um, so it's hard to imagine how a person, and I'm talking about Daenerys specifically, how a person who partially derives their right to govern from a preternatural source, because her power isn't mundane. She's not saying I have a right to rule because I'm the wisest among you, or because I have all the characteristics and properties that make me a good ruler. No. Daenerys claims partially her right to govern and her right to political power from a preternatural source, which is being the mother of dragons. That's where she derives her source. And the thing about claiming a preternatural or even a supernatural source for power is that there's no way to check it. There's no way to question it. This is the problem with all monarchies, going back to the pharaohs of Egypt. Once someone says that my power is more than historical, is more than mundane, but that is super historical, that it's transcendental, that it's divine, that it's supernatural, that it's God given. Once somebody starts making claims like that, there's no way to check their power, there's no way to question their authority. And the only recourse at that point is to violence. And it's hard to imagine how someone could wield that type of claim to power and authority without becoming corrupted by it, especially given the context of the story so far. Hard to imagine. And Daenerys at this point is essentially the female version of the divine right of kings. Used to be the case that monarchs said, "I have a right to rule because I've been chosen by God." That's sort of the same thing with Daenerys. Little different, but pretty much the same thing. Instead of the father, the paternalistic father, you have the maternalistic mother. Instead of being divine, she's preternatural. Um, so it's almost the same thing. But no matter what, the one thing that remains constant is the idea that she has the power and authority to rule through some sort of special dispensation. That's the one thing that's clear between those two paradigms, if you will. Basically, she claims that she has a special right to mete out justice or mercy. In George W. Bush's words, she's the decider. That's what she told Barrister Selmy. I'm the decider. What I say goes. That's basically the role Daenerys has at this point. So if you had some high hopes for Daenerys, you might be very, very disappointed in how her character arc turns out. Plus, she has this whole "I'm going to wage war on Westeros" thing. So at heart, she's a conqueror. Now let's talk about Brienne and Jaime, which is really the heart of this episode, which is where the title comes from, Oathbreaker, which is the name given to Jaime's Valyrian steel blade. So Jaime finally gets around to keeping his oath to Catelyn Stark, and he enlists Brienne to help him do it. And I was pretty surprised that he gave Brienne his Valyrian steel sword. I mean, a normal sword wasn't good enough? I don't know. But then again, this makes sense because Jaime really doesn't see the sword as anything special. He certainly doesn't see it in the same light that Tywin sees it in. I mean, after all, Jaime spurns his inheritance at every opportunity. So it would make sense that if he was given a Valyrian steel sword by his father as part of his potential inheritance, because Tywin still holds out hope that Jaime will come back into the fold and accept his inheritance as someone who will carry on the Lannister legacy. It makes sense that Jaime would give it away to Brienne, unless he's just loaning it to her, which that didn't really seem to be the case in this episode, but that could be the case. But now let's talk about the importance of the relationship between Jaime and Brienne in this episode, and Jaime's characterization in particular. The extent of Jaime's cognitive dissonance is quite remarkable. He's probably one of the most fully realized characters in the entire show because of the development of this cognitive dissonance that he now has. So on one hand, Jaime is the guy who just kind of raped his sister next to the dead body of their son. Then he promises that very same sister that he no longer intends to keep an oath to a dead woman. But on the other hand, he does an about face, or at least lies to Cersei about his true intentions and motivations and desires, and enlists the help of Brienne to help him keep that oath. Really? Wow. Like I said, that is some very remarkable cognitive dissonance. I mean, Jaime literally has two components of his personality. One component, he's incredibly self-interested and self-absorbed, incredibly neurotic. We saw this in the very first episode when he pushes Bran out the tower and paralyzes him. Incredibly violent, incredibly callous, incredibly self-interested. But on the other hand, there have been times throughout the series where there seemed to be a little spark of goodness in Jaime, where he seemed to be capable of redemption and goodness. And at the very least, a lot of people thought that that would be his path once he lost his sword hand. So he has both of those components of his personality in his psyche, dueling it out for supremacy. And Brienne is very important symbolically because she functions as a way to highlight the redemptive aspects of his character and bring that cognitive dissonance to the forefront. And this is precisely what I was talking about when I mentioned in my episode 1 review, where I talked about the difference between character development and character growth. Character development doesn't always mean character growth. It doesn't mean that you will progress or regress in one way. That's what growth means. There's positive growth. In other words, you get better as a person, as a character, and negative growth. You just regress. You get worse. But there is a way to develop a character without them having any growth whatsoever. They can just develop. There could just be character development where more dimensions of their characterization are brought to the forefront without them either growing or regressing as a character. And I think that's pretty much panned out. That my prediction for Jaime's characterization has pretty much uh, panned out. Um, he really hasn't become more moral. Uh, it's just that Brienne has allowed him to bring out something within himself that was always there, but was never quite out in the open and was never quite allowed to flourish within his character, within himself. And I think that this dichotomy between the Jaime who can rape his sister and the Jaime who can keep an oath to protect the children of a dead woman uh, is just a perfect way to encapsulate this. Perfect way to encapsulate this. Uh, so yeah, this is pretty good writing. I will say that in terms of Jamie's characterization, this is very good writing, and to have these episodes back to back like this, the rape of Cersei and then keeping the oath to a dead woman back to back, very stark contrast in the space of two episodes, two back to back episodes. Now let's talk about Jon Snow very quickly. This stuff was very predictable, and honestly, I didn't really care about this subplot too much. First of all, these kids are a bunch of idiots for being captured, and second of all, um, it was clear that Jon was what needed some way narratively as a plot device to get to Craster's keep in order to talk to Bran to save them, whatever. Not really interested in that. And also, Locke is finally showing up to the party. So we were all expecting Locke to show up. He's finally shown up. Now let's talk about the White Walkers, just very briefly. So we finally have confirmation on what we all pretty much knew to be the case, which is that the babies that were being abandoned by Craster, the male babies, are the White Walkers, or maybe not they are not the White Walkers, but they were being turned into White Walkers. That's a better way to put it. Talk about some sick irony. That is some pretty sick irony. The babies being turned into White Walkers. First of all, it's not even that they're being turned into White Walkers. The fact that they are abandoned and then turned into White Walkers is a perfect symbol for the culture of cannibalism of Game of Thrones. And I don't mean cannibalism literally. I mean it metaphorically, because that's what that culture is. It's a cannibalistic culture, a culture full of social predators, and all of them are trying to kill each other in order to be the apex predator. That's the cannibal culture in Westeros, in the Game of Thrones. And we see that this cultural psychopathology of violence is to the point of being of not just being about the infliction of violence on others, but about how it's suicidal. I mean, imagine if you and a group of people got together and said, "We're going to do our best to try and kill each other." To enter into that sort of agreement would be pathologically suicidal. Think about that. I mean, because you are drastically increasing your probability of death if you try to get into an agreement like that with a group of people. It's just it's just suicidal. But that's what Westeros is. A bunch of people who created a society on the foundation of let's try to kill each other to get what we want. Everybody individually has a very low percentage of surviving that type of arrangement. It's just suicidal. And not only do they have a very low probability of surviving individually, but they also have a very low probability of their society flourishing I mean, we're starting to see the complete destabilization of Westeros as a civilization. I mean, it's suicidal. It's like some macabre version of the Ouroboros. That's exactly what the babies symbolize, and the babies being turned into White Walkers symbolize. And also, before I forget, White Walkers have a hierarchy. I really was not expecting that. I mean, there apparently there's, at least that we know of, two tiers of White Walkers. I guess ones who are the grunts and the ones who are the higher ups with the kind of horns on their head. I wonder what that's all about, and I wonder if we'll get a more in-depth look at, I guess you can call them a society, the more in-depth look at the White Walker society. Uh, so all in all, I will say this. I was also, before I almost forgot this, but I just managed to remember. Uh, I got to go back and talk about Daenerys for a second before I end this review. The fight scenes, or the lack of fight scenes. I like the fact, as I mentioned in my last episode review, that Daenerys used slave insurrections as a military tactic and strategy, and also as a form of political tactics and strategy. Uh, but what the hell, man? The takeover of the city was just completely lackluster. I mean, it lasted for like maybe one or two scenes, and I mean, it was just, it was whack. To put it simply, to be less erudite about the matter, it was whack. Complete disappointment. I wonder if there was some pacing problems, like they just couldn't fit it all into one episode, and they had to quickly gloss over the situation. But in any event, Game of Thrones is not really known for very extravagant action sequences anyway. Uh, but the fight to wage a war on an entire city just went by too fast, and it was just too lackluster. Huge disappointment. So now I'm ready to wrap up this review. So besides being disappointed by the lack of action in this episode and some predictable plots with respect to the Jon Snow subplot, this was still a very well written episode, pretty decent episode. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.